What if a single family had gathered for Thanksgiving every year for 400 years, and every generation ended with someone missing? Welcome, viewers. Before we begin, write in the comments what time and location you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Tonight's story is unlike any Thanksgiving tale you've ever heard, because this one begins with a question no family should ever have to ask. What do you do when the tradition you were raised to honor was built to destroy you? In 2021, as the Winthrop family prepared their 400th consecutive Thanksgiving feast, a young woman discovered a set of torn journal pages hidden inside the family Bible. Pages that were never meant to be found. The ink was 4 centuries old. The warning inside it was older. What followed was not a haunting, not a legend, but a revelation that forced an entire bloodline to confront the truth behind its own rituals. This is the story of a covenant, born in the shadows of the first Thanksgiving and the descendants who tried to escape it. Lean in, because once you hear what was written on those pages, you'll understand why some traditions should never survive. Thanksgiving in the Winthrop household never began with food. It began with objects, old ones, laid out across the dining room like relics retrieved from soil rather than storage. The family Bible sat at the center, its leather split at the spine, its edges feathered from 4 centuries of palms. Sarah Winthrop had handled it every year of her life, yet this time, the moment her fingertips brushed the cover, something in her paused. Not fear. Recognition, like a memory she had never lived. Her grandmother's final warning, whispered the week she died, surfaced uninvited. Never read what was removed. The kitchen behind her was alive with the rhythm of tradition. Eleanor's voice floated faintly from the adjoining room, steady and ceremonial, as she recited the annual preparations. Silver polished, candles trimmed, the table set exactly according to the layout passed down for generations. To anyone else, it would seem charming. To Sarah, trained to look for patterns in chromosomes and code, it felt rigid, like a system with no room for mutation. She opened the Bible carefully, expecting the familiar list of births and deaths, inked by long-gone Winthrop hands. Instead, she saw something new, something out of place. The pages didn't lie flat. There was weight tucked inside the binding, uneven, brittle. When she pressed slightly, a corner of torn parchment shifted free. She removed it with 2 fingers, the way she might handle a fragile microscope slide. The paper was thinner than the Bible pages, its edges jagged, ripped, not cut. The ink had browned to the color of dried leaves. A date sat at the top in trembling script, 1621. Sarah's pulse tightened. That year was the one story the Winthrops told without variation, the beginning of everything they commemorated. The feast, the covenant, the origin of the family's unbroken Thanksgiving line. Yet the handwriting before her didn't match the neat entries Eleanor read from each year. It felt raw, urgent, written by someone whose hand did not have time to steady. A faint tremor passed through Sarah's left hand. She blamed the cold. She blamed exhaustion. She didn't blame genetics, though the thought hovered, as persistent as the flicker in the candle beside her. She angled the parchment toward the light. A few words stood out immediately. Choice, purity, seal. Their contexts still hidden beneath faded sentences. They carried none of the gratitude she had been taught to associate with this holiday. They carried something heavier. Behind her, footsteps approached. Thomas Winthrop, her father, paused at the doorway. His jaw, pronounced in the familiar family way, clenched slightly as he noticed what she held. For a moment neither spoke. He simply looked at the torn page, as if seeing something that should have remained lost. "Where did you find that?" he asked, the words quiet but edged. Sarah didn't answer. Not yet. The room felt different now, quieter, as though the house itself recognized what she had disturbed. Centuries of ritual had always been presented as love, as continuity, as identity. But as the candle guttered and the ink on the page seemed to darken, Sarah understood something she had never allowed herself to consider. Some traditions endure not because they are cherished, but because they are protected. Protected from scrutiny, protected from sunlight, protected from the very person holding them now. And for the first time, she wondered what the Winthrops had been protecting for 400 years. The Winthrop dining room had always felt older than the house. Its walls carried more memory than paint, more lineage than decoration. Tonight, for the 400th Thanksgiving, the room looked unchanged from Sarah Winthrop's earliest recollections. Yet she felt it watching her differently. Portraits lined the walls, arranged in perfect symmetry from floor to ceiling. Some faces stared back openly, their brushstrokes cracked but intact. Others were covered with linen squares, pinned at the corners as though shielding the room from their gaze. These shrouded frames had been part of the ritual for as long as Sarah could remember. But this year, the symmetry felt intentional, protective rather than mourning. She counted 6 covered faces. There had always been 6. Across the room, the family tree hung in its gilded frame. It was less a tree and more a loop, a circular diagram where branches curved inward, names repeating in patterns almost too neat to be natural. To a genealogist, it would look like a closed circuit. To Sarah, trained in genetics, it looked like an equation written with no variables. Eleanor Winthrop stood at the head of the table, preparing the sacred reading with the precision of someone conducting a service rather than hosting a meal. Her posture was straight despite her age. Her jawline, sharp, familial, carried both authority and strain. She turned fragile pages with a reverence that suggested something more binding than tradition. Thomas hovered behind her, adjusting silverware that was already perfectly aligned. The tremor in his right hand was more pronounced tonight, his movements slightly delayed, as though each one required conscious correction. He avoided looking at the covered portraits. When his gaze brushed the family tree, a shadow crossed his expression. Guilt, long settled, shifting beneath the surface. Rebecca sat 3 chairs down, her posture situ, hild-like despite her 19 years. She traced invisible shapes on the tablecloth with her fingertips, loops, circles, intersecting lines that resembled the family tree's pattern more than any idle distraction. Her hair fell across her face, but every now and then she glanced towards Sarah with an expression of soft curiosity, as if studying her rather than greeting her. Sarah took her seat, feeling the weight of inherited expectations settle around her like another layer of linen on the portraits. Every place setting was identical, the same antique plates passed through generations. The turkey waited at the center of the table, untouched, as though its presence served a symbolic purpose rather than a culinary one. This was not a family dinner. It was a ceremony. The room's quiet deepened when Eleanor lifted the Bible. Conversations stopped mid-breath, utensils stilled, and even Rebecca's hands folded neatly in her lap. Eleanor began to speak, her voice steady, unwavering, practiced. She recited William Winthrop's words with the fluency of someone who had memorized them decades ago. Sarah watched the others, the subtle nods, the synchronized breaths, the unspoken agreement to keep the ritual intact. This was a family bound less by love than by continuity. 4 centuries of repetition, each generation inheriting not just tradition, but the fear of what might happen if it ever broke. Tonight, surrounded by faces both visible and concealed, Sarah understood something she had not allowed herself to see. Some absences in the room were intentional, some silences had been preserved, and some faces were missing because someone, long ago, wanted them forgotten. Eleanor's voice carried the weight of practiced certainty. Every year she began the sacred reading at the same place in William Winthrop's 1621 journal, her tone steady enough to disguise the fragility of the pages she held. Tonight, though, Sarah heard something else beneath the cadence, an inconsistency, small but unmistakable. The phrasing was older than the text she remembered. The dates slightly misaligned with the historical record she'd studied in school. Even the sequence of events felt rearranged. She leaned forward, scanning the journal from her seat, comparing Eleanor's recitation with the printed lines on the page. A sentence that should have begun with gratitude instead began with obedience. Another referenced a gathering after the sealing, a term Sarah had never heard in any retelling of the first Thanksgiving. The deviations were subtle enough that no one else noticed. But Sarah's mind snagged on them, the way a researcher notices an anomaly in a dataset, a clue hidden in plain sight. As Eleanor turned the next page, Sarah shifted slightly, and the torn parchment she had found earlier slipped free from her sleeve. It drifted downward with a whisper of sound, landing between the candle and the serving tray. In any other household, the noise would have been insignificant. Here, it silenced the room. Eleanor stopped mid-sentence. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time that evening, her composure fractured. Not dramatically, just a tightening of the jaw, a tremor at the corner of her mouth, but enough for Sarah to recognize the reaction. Fear, immediate and unguarded. Thomas took an involuntary step backward. Rebecca's hands retreated beneath the table. Even the younger cousins glanced toward their parents, unsure of what rule had just been broken. Sarah picked up the page before anyone else could. The ink was faded, but readable. A new date
appeared at the top, November the 1621, not aligned with the feast day as recorded in colonial history. Below it, a passage written in William's uneven script described a gathering that happened after the settlers had eaten, after the prayers had been spoken, after the governor had retired. The wording was careful, almost ceremonial. Tonight, we seal the covenant. The union will be kept hidden from the colony, sanctified only within our blood. Sarah read further. William spoke not of gratitude or survival, but of a promise made under God's insistence. A union arranged between his own children to preserve what he called divine lineage. No interpretation softened the meaning. The ink left no room for doubt. Eleanor reached for the parchment, but Sarah held it tighter. The silence around them thickened, replacing tradition with something colder. Recognition. 4 centuries of ritual now felt less like heritage and more like evidence. Sarah looked up, meeting the eyes of her family one by one. In each expression she saw a different truth: denial, resignation, terror, and in Eleanor's case, a resolve sharpened by decades of secrecy. The room hadn't changed. The table remained set. The candles still burned. But the story that had held this family together for generations had just changed beyond repair. The forbidden pages did not read like the rest of the journal. Where the familiar entries William Winthrop left behind had been neat and controlled, these lines looked pressed into the paper, letters crowded together as if trying to outrun doubt. Sarah read them slowly, not as a descendant seeking comfort, but as a researcher examining the origin of a pathology. In 1621, Plymouth was not a mythic beginning. It was a struggling outpost at the edge of survival. Too few people, too little food, too much faith placed in a God who often answered with silence. William recorded all of that with clinical precision. Failed harvests, illness, the burial count rising through the winter. But woven between the practical notes was something else, a conviction that misfortune meant selection, that suffering proved his family had been chosen for a purpose others could not understand. He cited Scripture not as guidance, but as confirmation. Verses about being a peculiar people, set apart, were underlined, annotated, folded into his own theology. He wrote of unclean mingling with other settlers, of dangerous intermixture with indigenous people. To him, diversity was not survival. It was contamination. Sarah paused over a line that was circled twice, the ink darker, as though he had returned to it again and again. What God has purified, let no man dilute. In William's mind, purity was not moral, It was genealogical. The account of the first Thanksgiving appeared next, stripped of its later romantic gloss. The feast was functional, a temporary truce with hunger and fear. William mentioned the shared meal, the presence of Wampanoag allies, the governor's blessing, yet his tone shifted afterward, turning inward. Once the others had retired, once prayers had been spoken and the public performance of gratitude completed, he described withdrawing to a smaller room lit by tallow and coal. There, surrounded by a handful of family members, he performed a second ceremony. He referred to his son and daughter not by name but by role, the heir and the vessel. It was a deliberate reduction, stripping them of individuality and turning them into instruments of his design. He wrote of placing their hands together, of invoking Abraham and Isaac, of framing their union not as sin but as sacrifice, a surrender of ordinary life in service of a chosen line. No one outside the family was present. No church record would ever acknowledge it. William knew the colony's laws well enough to avoid public scrutiny. Yet in his private pages, he documented the moment with the certainty of a man convinced that history would vindicate him. Sarah read the passage again, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that he understood what he was doing. There was none. Only the steady hand of a patriarch, convinced that God had given him license to redraw the boundaries of kinship. Behind her, Thomas finally spoke, his voice thin. "We always knew William was strict," he said. "We were told the covenant meant separation from the world. No one said how far it went." Fragments of family stories, a hidden wedding, a night of sealing, a warning never to question the journal, rearranged themselves in Sarah's mind. What had been framed as devotion now revealed itself as design. The closed loop of the family tree did not begin by accident or by necessity. It began as obedience to one man's interpretation. The curse was not mystical. It was authored, and its first sentence was written the night the rest of the colony slept, believing they had only shared a meal. Sarah moved from portrait to portrait the way an archivist studies a sequence of damaged documents, each generation adding a new flaw, each frame a record of choices disguised as fate. The earliest Winthrops, painted in the decades after 1621, looked unremarkable at first glance. Plain clothing, rigid Puritan posture, expressions shaped by discipline rather than personality. But when she compared their birth records, something else emerged. From 1621 to 1700, the marriages formed a loop. Cousins joined cousins, the surnames inside the family tree repeating like a closed chant. Winthrop to Winthrop, branch into branch, the pattern unbroken. The justifications, written in marginal notes and preserved letters, invoked purity, obedience, and continuance of the covenant. The entries did not mention affection. They mentioned duty. By the mid-1700s, the portraits changed. The symmetry of earlier generations softened, then warped. A jawline too prominent. Eyes set closer than the painter likely intended. Shoulders that sloped unevenly despite careful posing. The decline was not dramatic, but cumulative. Small shifts that gained momentum with each generation. Sarah catalogued them the way she would document phenotypes in a genetic study. The resemblance was unmistakable. Documents from the late 1700s and early 1800s referenced illnesses using the language of the era. Melancholia, fits of madness, confusion of mind. The terms were vague, but the pattern was not. By the mid-1800s, multiple branches of the family withdrew from town life entirely. School records mentioned withdrawals. Marriage licenses halted. The Winthrop estate expanded as if absorbing its members into itself, offering seclusion where scrutiny might otherwise have taken root. Between 1800 and 1900, mental illness turned from rare occurrence to characteristic trait. Diaries described relatives who wander, and at night speaking to absent figures. A ledger from 1872 listed 3 Winthrops who refused to eat for fear of poison,
a fear that reappeared a century later in medical evaluations. The line between heredity and environment blurred. Isolation had become both cause and consequence. By the early 1900s, the family's population began shrinking. Births decreased, deaths increased, and records of marriages nearly vanished. Children were homeschooled not for academic preference, but to prevent outside contact. Photographs replaced painted portraits. The transitions captured the starkness of reality without artistic intervention. In the 1920s, 5 family members disappeared from documentation altogether. Their names were scratched out of a genealogy chart, not erased cleanly, just enough to obscure, not enough to forget. The late 20th century revealed the final narrowing. By 2000, only 12 Winthrops remained. The estate functioned like a closed ecosystem, its occupants living parallel to the town rather than within it. Medical records showed consistent patterns: tremors, jaw deformities, infertility, and cognitive decline. The covenant had produced not strength, but collapse. Sarah had suspected this. She had seen the loops in the family tree. But nothing prepared her for the discovery that came last, a truth not written in any ledger, but confessed in a whisper behind a locked door. Thomas, her father, admitted that Rebecca's mother had not been a distant relative or a tragic figure lost young as the family claimed. She had been his sister. Rebecca, the quiet girl tracing circles on the tablecloth, was not simply a cousin. She was the living evidence of a lineage collapsing under its own design. The vault had always been part of the house's mythology, mentioned quietly, referenced indirectly, never opened in Sarah's lifetime. The door sat behind the cellar shelves, disguised beneath coats of paint that failed to hide the outline of iron hinges. When she finally turned the key, taken from Eleanor's room while the others slept, the air that escaped was stale, dense, and untouched for generations. Inside, the space was small, not a room, but a chamber for preservation. Shelves lined the walls, each stacked with documents older than the nation itself. But it was the center table that held the weight of the past. William Winthrop's complete journals, bound in leather, that had darkened to almost black. The entries she had seen earlier were fragments of this larger volume, carefully curated extracts chosen to support a carefully curated lineage. Now she saw the rest. William's theology was not written in metaphors or allegory. It was clinical, deliberate. He wrote of purification through union, of closing the circle, of preserving a line that he believed God had refined through hardship. The language grew more urgent as the entries progressed, the handwriting thickening where the ink pooled. He described the colony's fragility not as a threat, but as evidence that only a chosen remnant would survive. And in his vision, that remnant came from his own blood. He detailed his belief that inbreeding would concentrate what he called spiritual traits: obedience, insight, divine receptivity. He spoke of ancestral gifts that would emerge only when the lineage remained sealed. What modern science would call recessive disorders, he framed as divine markers. A twisted jaw was not deformity, but the sign of chosen bone. Tremors were the Lord's trembling. Mental instability was the burden of the gifted. Generations after him had absorbed this language. They reinterpreted weakness as proof of prophecy. Deformities became trials. Decline became destiny. Sarah read through the centuries, the entries passing from William to his son, then his grandson, each adding new layers of obedience. The journal became less a record and more a script, a manual for preserving a bloodline that had long ceased to resemble anything human. She set the book aside only when a memory surfaced. Her own DNA results, still folded in her jacket pocket. She removed the paper, flattening it against the table. 12 recessive disorders identified as carriers. 12. Numbers that should have been statistical anomalies were, in this family, expected outcomes. The room felt smaller. Footsteps sounded behind her. Eleanor had followed. She didn't look angry. She looked relieved, as if some burden had finally passed to another set of hands. "You understand now," Eleanor said quietly. Purity was never about superiority. It was about preservation. A covenant maintained by blood, strengthened by sacrifice. Sarah stared at her. "Sacrifice?" Eleanor nodded. Not with hesitation, only with age. "Every 100 years? One life to protect the rest. It was written from the beginning. 1721, 1821, 1921. Each century had its offering. And now?" She exhaled, the sound thin and final. "Now it is 2021. The vault's silence swallowed the words. The papers, the journals, the centuries. They no longer felt historical. They felt imminent. This was no longer a family tradition. It was a deadline. Sarah spread the documents across the dining table, the same table her ancestors had gathered around for 4 centuries. Tonight, it served a different purpose. Not ceremony. Evidence. The pattern began quietly, almost invisibly, buried beneath overlapping family stories. But once she aligned the journals, the portraits, and the missing entries in the genealogy, 3 absences formed a symmetry too precise to dismiss. 21. The first erasure was Mary Winthrop, age 17. A portrait remained, unfinished, the lower half of the canvas scraped clean. Her name appeared only once in the official ledger, born 1704, no date of death. Sarah found a fragment of Mary's writing folded inside a hymnal. The ink was faint, but the fear was intact. Mary questioned the covenant, calling it a chain rather than God's will. A week later, William's grandson wrote in the family journal of a necessary offering at the well. The town records listed Mary as missing. The family recorded nothing at all. 21. A century later, James Winthrop disappeared. His portrait showed a young man with eyes that didn't match the rest of the family. Brighter, searching. Letters exchanged with a woman from a neighboring colony revealed his intent to marry outside the bloodline. The correspondence stopped abruptly 2 days before Thanksgiving. The official family narrative claimed he left to build a new life. But Sarah found a coroner's note from the same year, describing an unidentified man pulled from the river. Age and clothing matched James. The death was filed as accidental, with no family inquiry. Chapter 21. The last disappearance before Sarah's generation belonged to Catherine. Her photograph showed a young woman standing at the edge of the estate orchard, posture stiff, expression guarded. Hospital records described episodes of clarity, moments when she confronted her mother about the family's prices. Teases. On Thanksgiving night, a fire consumed the west wing of the house. The family claimed a candle overturned. The fire report told a different story. The blaze originated in Catherine's locked bedroom. She had been unable to escape before the floor collapsed. 3 centuries. 3 young relatives, each one questioning, each one erased. Sarah catalogued the alignment. 1721, 1821, 1921. Every 100 years. Always the same time of year. Always someone young enough to resist tradition, old enough to understand it. The pattern was not superstition. It was policy. She examined Eleanor's journals next. The entries avoided explicit confession, but the language was unmistakable. One must be reclaimed. The cycle must remain unbroken. The covenant preserved us when the world threatened to poison our line. Words coded but not obscured. To Eleanor, these sacrifices were continuation, not cruelty. Sarah's breath tightened as she focused on the current year, 2021. Her age, her descent, her questions. She fit the pattern exactly. She wasn't a threat because she disbelieved the covenant. She was a threat because she understood it.
And in a family shaped by obedience, understanding could be fatal. The documents lay before her, 3 centuries of silence weaponized into tradition. The horror wasn't in the deaths themselves, but in their careful integration into the family's story, rewritten until even tragedy served the covenant. Now, as the candlelight flickered across the table, Sarah recognized what Eleanor had already decided. The next necessary offering was seated in the same house, breathing the same air, preparing for the same Thanksgiving night. And for the first time, the covenant had met its match. Not another obedient descendant, but a witness. The 400th Thanksgiving should have begun the way it always had. Silence, ritual, the weight of inherited obedience pressing down on the long table. But this year, as the family gathered beneath portraits of ancestors who had enforced the covenant with unwavering conviction, Sarah stood before them, not as a participant, but as a witness, prepared to dismantle 4 centuries of secrecy. She placed the documents on the table one by one: medical reports, genealogical charts, the missing journal pages, the death records of Mary, James, and Catherine. The paper edges brushed against heirloom silver, interrupting the symmetry the family had maintained for generations. Eleanor's expression hardened first. Her posture, rigid as carved wood, did not falter as she watched Sarah lay out the evidence, but her fingers tightened around the Bible she held, as though anchoring herself to the last remaining symbol of control. Thomas looked between Sarah and the documents, the tremor in his hand worsening. For years, he had lived suspended between loyalty and guilt, an archivist of his own family's collapse. Now, confronted with the compiled truth, the tension that had shaped his adulthood finally snapped. "It's all real," he said, voice unsteady. "Every pattern she found, every disappearance, every lie we were fed." A murmur passed through the room. Some recoiled, others leaned forward. The fracture that had quietly grown across generations finally surfaced. Those who believed tradition protected them, and those who realized it had consumed them. Sarah spoke with the calm of someone who had practiced these words alone in the dark. The covenant wasn't faith. It wasn't protection. It was control. And it nearly destroyed every one of you. She unfolded her DNA report, the numbers stark under the chandelier's light. 12 recessive disorders, a statistical impossibility, unless the bloodline was deliberately closed. Aunts and uncles exchanged glances, the weight of unspoken fear filling the air. Rebecca watched silently, her hands folded tightly, eyes fixed on Sarah with a mixture of confusion and hope, 2 emotions rarely allowed in the Winthrop line. Eleanor rose slowly, setting the Bible on the table with reverence, as if preparing a counter-argument forged entirely from scripture and willpower. Her voice, usually controlled, wavered with something older than anger: preservation. "You speak of science," she said, "but you know nothing of covenant. William understood what God required. Each generation renewed that promise. Without it, our line would have perished long ago." Thomas's composure crumbled. "Mother, our line did perish. You just didn't see it happening." The room shifted. Chairs inched back. Generational loyalties realigned in real time. Half the family moved closer to Eleanor instinctively, clinging to tradition as if it were oxygen. The others gravitated towards Sarah and Thomas, seeking escape from a structure they had never fully questioned. Sarah reached into her bag and withdrew William's original journal, the unfiltered, unedited version. She held it up long enough for the family to recognize it, then crossed the room to the fireplace. Eleanor lunged forward, but Thomas held her back. The journal met the flames with a muted exhale. The parchment curled, ink dissolving into smoke, as centuries of doctrine broke apart. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, the kind that history often overlooks but families never forget. Through the windows, faint sirens approached, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Sarah had called them before entering the house, knowing the covenant would not fall without resistance. The police lights reflected off the glassware, washing the table in red and blue. The room held its breath. For the first time since 162, the covenant did not answer back. 6 months after the fire, the Winthrop estate existed only in county records and demolition reports. The land had been sold to a development firm, its structures flattened, the soil sifted for artifacts before construction could begin. What remained was boxed, catalogued, and stored in climate-controlled archives, journals, letters, portraits, and pieces of furniture too damaged to restore, yet too historically entangled to discard. For the first time in 4 centuries, the Winthrop family occupied no physical territory of its own. The surviving relatives scattered quietly. Some relocated to nearby towns, others to distant states, each stepping into a world they had once been taught to fear. Their departures were unceremonious. No final prayer readings, no covenant acknowledgements, no goodbyes heavy with obligation. They simply left, leaving behind a legacy too heavy to carry intact. Rebecca was the one who required the most immediate care. Her transfer to a specialized psychiatric facility was arranged by professionals rather than family members. The staff evaluated her developmental delays, her repetitive drawing habits, and the trauma woven through her upbringing. For the first time in her life, she interacted with people outside the Winthrop line. Progress was slow, measured in small moments. Her willingness to speak during sessions, her ability to distinguish between ritual and routine. Her caregivers noted that she often asked where Sarah was. Thomas entered therapy of his own accord. Years of guilt surfaced quickly, the secrecy he maintained, the truths he buried, and the role he played in perpetuating a structure he privately questioned but publicly upheld. His sessions focused not on blame, but on the psychological gravity of generational systems, how belief becomes habit, and habit becomes obedience. He spoke often of his children, especially Rebecca, and the Hopi, that her future might deviate from the lineage he once accepted without resistance. Eleanor's world, however, remained unchanged. Institutionalized after the night of the confrontation, she settled into a pattern that mirrored her life at the estate. She wrote daily in composition books provided by the staff, filling page after page with scripture-like passages, fragments of doctrine, reinterpretations of William's words, warnings about dilution and legacy. Her handwriting, once disciplined, now drifted unevenly across the paper. She never mentioned the fire. She never asked about her family. She only asked for more notebooks. Sarah divided her time between Boston and the Central Archives, where she worked with geneticists to document the Winthrop line as a case study, anonymized, structured, and stripped of sensationalism. The researchers emphasized education, prevention, and the ethical handling of inherited trauma. They charted carrier frequencies, mutation rates, and the progression of recessive disorders across generations. The data was compelling. The human story behind it, sobering. Yet even amid scientific clarity, Sarah carried a private unease. Her pregnancy had been monitored closely, each appointment a balance between hope and apprehension. The early scans suggested normal development. The genetic tests showed no immediate red flags. But she understood better than anyone that biology did not erase the past. It echoed it. She did not fear her child inheriting a curse. She feared inheriting a silence, the kind that once masked suffering as faith and obedience as destiny. The covenant had been broken, but its shadow remained, subtle and patient, waiting to see what the next generation would choose. The Winthrop covenant is a fictional construction, but the forces that shaped it, religion, isolation, and hereditary collapse, are rooted deeply in documented history. To understand how a bloodline could fracture under its own doctrine, historians begin with the theology that defined early Puritan life. The Puritans interpreted Scripture through a framework known as covenant theology, a belief that entire families could be bound to God through collective obedience. These covenants governed not just worship, but marriage,
inheritance, discipline, and community membership. When such theology hardened into extremism, it justified choices that outsiders viewed as coercive, but insiders considered necessary for spiritual survival. Marriage practices in colonial America reflected the reality of small, insular settlements. Cousin unions were legal and common in several colonies, not as transgression, but as practicality. Communities were small, travel was dangerous, and alliances between families determined land, labor, and protection. Within these conditions, the boundary between acceptable consanguinity and dangerous inbreeding could blur. No record suggests that sibling unions were sanctioned, yet the absence of oversight in isolated settlements meant that extreme practices could occur without formal documentation. A patriarch with sufficient authority could impose private rules under the guise of obedience to Scripture. Genetic specialists analyzing historical populations note that closed bloodlines behave predictably over time. Recessive disorders amplify through repeated consanguineous unions. Each generation increases the likelihood of physical deformities, infertility, impaired immunity, and cognitive decline. The Habsburg dynasty, whose jaw deformity became a recognizable phenotypic marker, is one of the most well-known examples. Egyptian pharaohs practiced intrafamilies, marriages to preserve divine status, resulting in skeletal abnormalities observable in surviving remains. In isolated religious settlements, founder effects created communities where rare disorders became statistically common. The fictional Winthrop line mirrors these real patterns not through exaggeration, but through mathematical inevitability. Psychologists examining early colonial societies highlight another pressure, the weight of isolation. Settlements functioned as closed systems where dissent threatened cohesion. Families who challenged dominant beliefs risked exile or spiritual condemnation. In such environments, obedience became a survival strategy passed from parent to child. Over generations, this conditioning evolved into what modern researchers call intergenerational transmission of trauma, the inheritance of fear, silence, and obligation. A family convinced of its divine selection could reinterpret genetic collapse as spiritual testing rather than biological failure. Historians also emphasize that extremism rarely appears abruptly. It accumulates through small, incremental decisions. A covenant designed to maintain unity becomes a doctrine of separation. A preference for familiar marriages becomes a rule against outsiders. A patriarch's conviction becomes law within a household. Over centuries, these shifts harden into tradition, indistinguishable from identity itself. When authority is inherited rather than earned, delusion can become a legacy. The Winthrop narrative synthesizes these historical realities into a single lineage, one shaped by doctrine, reinforced by isolation, and ultimately undone by the biological consequences of its own rules. The horror lies not in the fictional covenant, but in how easily history provides its scaffold. Families, communities, and nations have preserved systems long after evidence showed their harm. The Winthrops represent a pattern that has repeated across cultures: belief outlasting reason, loyalty outlasting survival, and tradition outlasting truth. In the end, the line between fiction and history is thinner than it appears. When a family seals its genealogy, collapse is not an accident. It is a calculation. Genetic counselors describe it as a simple algorithm. Limited ancestors produce limited variation. Over generations, this bottleneck creates a phenomenon known as the founder effect. A small number of founding individuals contribute disproportionately to the gene pool, meaning any recessive disorder carried by those founders is not diluted but amplified. In the Winthrop line, this mechanism would have functioned silently at first, emerging only as subtle traits: tremors, jaw irregularities, fragile immunity, before escalating into the unmistakable profile of a closed family system. Recessive traits by themselves are neither malicious nor rare. Most people carry at least one harmful recessive allele without consequence. The danger arises only when both parents share the same trait. In a sealed bloodline, that likelihood increases exponentially. Cousin marriages double the probability of shared recessives. Sibling unions push those probabilities into near certainty. Over centuries, disorders that appear in the general population at fractions of a percent can climb to double-digit prevalence within an isolated lineage. The results manifest as congenital deformities, neurological decline, infertility, and premature mortality, the same patterns seen across royal houses and abandoned religious sects. Scientists studying historical dynasties often use the term phenotypic collapse. This describes the visible unraveling of a family's physical structure. The Habsburg jaw is the most recognizable example, a feature so pervasive that it appears across portraits spanning multiple countries and generations. In remote mountain communities, entire settlements carried the same skeletal abnormalities due to founding populations of fewer than 20 individuals. And in one region of Appalachia, a metabolic disorder caused by a single recessive mutation produced a cluster of families whose skin appeared blue for generations. Isolation does not create new conditions. It magnifies existing ones until they become part of the community's identity. Over time, what begins as abnormality becomes normalized. Children grow up among relatives who share the same deformities, and family narratives reinterpret these traits as markers of distinction rather than symptoms. In religious or doctrinal communities, this reinterpretation becomes even more resilient. Doctrine reinforces the belief that deviation from the group is dangerous, while conformity, even when harmful, is holy. The Winthrop Covenant, though fictional, reflects this psychological mechanism. Faith becomes a container for genetic inevitability, and fear silences the instinct to seek help. Generational trauma compounds the biological risks. Families who internalize suffering as sacred create environments where pain is inherited as quietly as DNA. Children raised in such systems learn to distrust outsiders, dismiss warning signs, and maintain rituals that no longer serve survival. Psychologists note that traumatic patterns can persist long after the original cause is forgotten. A curse needs no supernatural agency, it needs only continuity. The collapse of a closed bloodline is therefore neither myth nor mystery. It is a convergence of genetics, geography, belief, and fear. Each generation tightens the boundary, reduces variation, and increases the probability that recessive traits will meet their match. The result is predictable: biological decline intertwined with psychological dependency, a lineage shrinking under the weight of its own history. The Winthrop family illustrates a truth documented across centuries. When a bloodline becomes its own, an universe collapse ceases to be a possibility and becomes a timeline. Sarah stands in front of what used to be the Winthrop estate, now an open field marked only by survey flags and the faint remains of a stone foundation. The landscape is quiet, unburdened, but she carries the memory of what once stood here. Her voice does not tremble when she speaks. It carries the tone of someone who survived a system designed to silence its own children. She begins not with tragedy, but with responsibility. She explains that families do not collapse in a single moment. They fracture slowly, through secrets, inherited fears, and patterns that become rules simply because no one dares question them. In her case, those rules were etched into scripture, reinforced by ritual, and handed down like heirlooms. In other households, she says, they take quieter forms, medical histories never shared, mental illness dismissed as temperament, relatives lost to accidents no one talks about. Silence, she warns, is not tradition. It is erosion. Her new mission is not to rewrite her family's past, but to prevent others from repeating it. She now works with genetic counselors who use the Winthrop records, stripped of names and identifying details, as a case study on the dangers of sealed genealogies. She describes how accessible testing can identify recessive disorders before they are passed on, how informed decisions can break cycles that once felt unavoidable. Scientific clarity, she notes, is not an accusation. It is an act of protection. The documentary cuts to the archive facility housing the salvaged Winthrop documents, journals in acid-free boxes, portraits digitally preserved,
medical files catalogued with clinical precision. Sarah views this preservation not as reverence for the past, but as a way to prevent it from repeating. Evidence, she says, is not meant to be worshipped. It's meant to be learned from. She then speaks about trauma, not the dramatic kind, the quiet inheritance that shapes generations. Children raised in environments of fear absorb patterns long before they understand them. Families that isolate themselves, physically or emotionally, create closed systems where harmful ideas can thrive unnoticed. Sarah explains how generational trauma can mimic what older cultures once called curses, repeating behaviors, repeating outcomes, repeating harm. What broke the Winthrop line was not a supernatural force. It was a refusal to confront the truth. As she speaks, the camera captures her hand resting on her stomach, an unconscious gesture, not a sentimental one. She acknowledges her pregnancy with careful honesty. The genetic tests show no immediate concerns, but she understands that biology is only half the inheritance. The rest comes from patterns, choices, and the stories parents choose to tell or withhold. Her child will not inherit the covenant, but Sarah knows that the absence of tradition does not automatically create safety. Only vigilance does. She ends her message without dramatics. Instead, she draws a simple line between the past and the present. Breaking a harmful tradition is a moment. Escaping its shadow is a lifetime. The Winthrop estate is gone. The covenant is ash, but the lesson remains. Families survive when truth is allowed to surface, not when silence is mistaken for protection. The clinic room was ordinary, soft lighting, muted walls, the faint hum of machinery calibrated to reassure rather than alarm. Sarah had walked into appointments like this hundreds of times as a researcher, guiding patients through genetic consultations. But today, she sat on the examination table herself, the gel cooling her skin, the monitor warming to life in front of her. The technician began with practiced ease. Small talk, routine measurements, the rhythmic sweep of the transducer gliding across her abdomen. Sarah watched the grayscale image emerge, an outline she had memorized from textbooks long before it belonged to her. At first, everything felt precise and predictable. The heartbeat flickered in steady pulses. The spine formed a clean arc, limbs extended and retracted in slow, experimental movements. The technician narrated each feature gently, marking them in the chart with confident strokes. Then came the pause. It was brief, a fraction of a second, but in clinical spaces, the smallest silences carry the heaviest weight. The technician's hand stilled. Her shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. She adjusted the angle of the transducer, then the contrast, then the zoom. Each movement was professional, controlled, and unmistakably searching. Sarah felt the shift immediately. Years of training sharpened her perception. She recognized the technician's attempt to remain neutral, the careful modulation of breath. She looked toward the monitor, hunting for what the other woman had seen. The jawline. On the screen, the fetal profile appeared delicate and unfinished, as expected at this stage. But beneath the softness, the contour had an asymmetry, subtle, faint, almost dismissible. Except it wasn't unfamiliar. The angle carried a slight elongation, a shallow downturn, the kind of early deviation Sarah had studied in historical portraits and genetic modeling. A trait that, in another era, had been rationalized as divine. The technician cleared her throat lightly and began explaining that early scans often show features that correct themselves as development progresses. Her voice carried no alarm, but her eyes avoided Sarah's, landing instead on the chart, the keyboard, anywhere else. Sarah recognized this too, a boundary drawn gently between observation and implication. She asked to review the still image. The technician hesitated, then rotated the monitor. Sarah leaned forward. The anomaly remained faint, barely more than a contour, But she knew the mathematics behind such traits, the inheritance patterns, the probabilities, the thresholds where variation becomes signal. Her pulse tightened. The room, once benign, felt suddenly close. As a geneticist, she understood that a single deviation did not predict a disorder. Development was dynamic. Scans were imperfect. Features shifted. But as a daughter of the Winthrop line, she felt an older instinct rise, an echo of dread shaped not by doctrine, but by memory. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. The covenant was gone. The rituals burned, the estate demolished. Yet something remained. Not a curse, not prophecy, but the residue of generations shaped by silence and fear. The technician printed the images and handed them to her with careful politeness. Sarah thanked her, voice composed, though her thoughts churned between science and uncertainty. As she stepped outside into the afternoon light, the ultrasound images folded neatly in her bag, she felt both the promise of new life and the shadow of the past pressing against each other. Legacy, she realized, does not vanish. It adapts. When demolition began on the Winthrop estate, the process was meant to be procedural. The fire had gutted most structural supports, and county inspectors had already cleared the property. Crews arrived with machinery designed to erase history cleanly, backhoes stripping soil, graders leveling the last remnants of the family's domain. By the second week, only the foundation stones remained, charred, fractured, and mapped for removal. The vault was discovered by accident. A crew member operating a hydraulic breaker noticed an unusual resistance beneath the northwest corner of the foundation. Stone that rang differently when struck, not fractured like the rest of the post-fire rubble. When the debris was cleared, a rectangular outline emerged, older than the surrounding structure, its mortar dense and discolored. It was not part of the original colonial cellar, nor the Victorian-era renovations. It belonged to some other addition, sealed later, concealed deliberately. The county supervisor halted the demolition and called in structural specialists. They documented the vault's dimensions, noting its unregistered placement on every known estate blueprint. The door bore no markings, only a rusted hinge structure embedded into the masonry. It took several hours to chip away enough stone to release the lock mechanism. When the door finally opened, the interior exhaled stale, cold air, unmoved for years, perhaps decades. Inside, the vault was empty except for a single object placed at perfect center, a journal. Not aged, not historical, new. Its leather cover was uncracked, its spine unmarred. The paper smelled of modern manufacture, clean, chemical-treated archival grade. A white tag adhered to the inside cover bore a date written in trembling cursive. Thanksgiving, 2025. 2 years after the estate burned. 1 year after Eleanor was confined under medical supervision, with no access to the property. The writing inside the journal matched the style of earlier Winthrop scripture. Short, declarative lines, biblical cadence, moral absolutism. But the ink was fresh. The strokes trembled in ways consistent with Eleanor's later notebooks from the institution. Forensic technicians compared samples and found strong alignment in pressure patterns and curvature, though the ink's manufacture post-dated her confinement. There were no signs of forced entry into the vault, no external footprints or disturbances in the sealed soil. The journal had been placed with intention, not hastily. Its pages referenced familiar themes: purity, lineage, obedience, but with a shift in tone. The earlier covenants commanded compliance. This one chronicled anticipation. The final entry was only 1 sentence long, written with more pressure than the rest, as though carved rather than penned. The 5th century will not begin without witness.
Investigators could not determine who placed the journal in the vault. Eleanor, physically weakened and under continuous supervision, had no plausible means. Her known associates had long since dispersed. No surviving family members claimed knowledge of the vault's existence. The discovery was logged, boxed, and archived with the rest of the Winthrop materials. The vault itself was filled with concrete and leveled, its contents reduced to a line item in a demolition report. Yet the unanswered question lingered, not because it hinted at the supernatural, but because it suggested something far more unsettling. Belief can persist even after its architects fall, migrating into new hands, new interpretations, new obsessions. The estate was gone. The covenant was ash. But the record continued. The documentary's final sequence opens on silence. The Winthrop estate, its walls, its rituals, its shadows, is gone. In its place lies a cleared field, winter-stilled and anonymous, as if history itself has been deliberately erased. But the camera moves slowly, deliberately, reminding viewers that erasure is not the same as resolution. Sarah stands at the edge of the property line, her child cradled against her shoulder. She does not speak at first. The quiet is intentional. A pause long enough to acknowledge that endings, when they finally arrive, rarely feel conclusive. When she does speak, her words are measured, not triumphant, not mournful, but aware. She explains her decision with simple clarity. Her child will grow up with truth, not doctrine. No secret archives, no protected stories, no inherited obligation disguised as destiny. She believes transparency is the only antidote to the silence that shaped generations before her. But even as she speaks, the camera frames her not as a figure delivering closure, but as someone taking her first steps into a future without a map. Cut to interviews with psychologists. They describe in clinical terms how trauma behaves when passed down, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, through expectations, behaviors, and unspoken rules. They explain how belief systems, once internalized, can outlast their architects, living on in descendants who no longer remember their origins. A system does not disappear because a building burns. It adapts because memory adapts. The documentary transitions to the State Archive facility. Rows of acid-free boxes line the shelves, each labeled with numbers instead of names. Inside these containers lie the remnants of a 4th-century structure. Portraits wrapped in muslin, brittle correspondence, medical files, hymnals annotated in the margins. Curators handle them with gloves, not reverence. They are artifacts now, evidence of a family that defined itself through allegiance to an idea. Among these boxes, a separate container sits under restricted access. The label reads, Winthrop Collection, Item 47C. The contents are not shown. The narrator explains that this piece of material was sealed by the state following psychological review. Experts deemed its content potentially destabilizing for involved survivors. Only one detail is provided. It was written by Eleanor during her final weeks. The camera holds on the box for a moment too long, creating a tension that is neither sensational nor comforting. It suggests that the Covenant's final echo did not vanish with the fire or with its last practitioner. It remains contained, preserved, and unread. An unresolved fragment of a belief system that once demanded absolute obedience. The closing montage is stark. Empty rooms, scorched beams, the outline of the vault before it was filled. A stone from the original cellar tagged for preservation. Sarah walking away from the camera, her child bundled close, her silhouette framed against an undecided horizon. No music rises, no resolution is offered. Instead, the documentary ends the way history often does, with a recognition that legacies do not disappear. They settle, they reshape themselves in the lives of those who come next. And as the screen fades to black, the lingering truth is not that the 5th century has begun, but that its shape is still unknown.